The Twin Brothers, from the Gray Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Once there was a fisherman who had plenty of money but no children. One day an old woman came to his wife and said,
"What use is all your prosperity to you when you have no children?"
"It is God's will," answered the fisherman's wife.
"Nay, my child, it is not God's will, but the fault of your husband. For if he would but catch the little goldfish, you would surely have children. Tonight, when he comes home, tell him he must go back and catch the little fish. He must then cut it in 6 pieces. One of these you must eat, and your husband the second, and soon after you will have 2 children. The 3rd piece you must give to the dog, and she will have 2 puppies. The 4th piece give to the mare, and she will have 2 foals. The 5th piece bury on the right of the house door, and the 6th on the left, and 2 cypress trees will spring up there."
When the fisherman came home at evening, his wife told him all that the old woman had advised, and he promised to bring home the little goldfish. Next morning, therefore, he went very early to the water and caught the little fish. Then they did as the old woman had ordered, and in due time the fisherman's wife had 2 sons, so like each other that no one could tell the difference. The dog had 2 puppies exactly alike. The mare had 2 foals, and on each side of the front door there sprang up 2 cypress trees precisely similar. When the 2 boys were grown up, they were not content to remain at home, though they had wealth in plenty, but they wished to go out into the world and make a name for themselves. Their father would not allow them both to go at once, as they were the only children he had. He said, "First one shall travel, and when he is come back, then the other may go." So the one took his horse and his dog and went, saying to his brother, "So long as the cypress trees are green, that is a sign that I am alive and well. But if one begins to wither, then make haste and come to me." So he went forth into the world. One day he stopped at the house of an old woman, and as at evening he sat before the door, he perceived in front of him a castle standing on a hill. He asked the old woman to whom it belonged, and her answer was,
"My son, it is the castle of the fairest in the land."
"And I am come here to woo her."
"That, my son, many have sought to do, and have lost their lives in the attempt, for she has cut off their heads and stuck them on the post you see standing there."
"And the same will she do to me, or else I shall be victor, for tomorrow I go there to court her." Then he took his zither and played upon it so beautifully that no one in all the land had ever heard the like, and the princess herself came to the window to listen. The next morning the fairest in the land sent for the old woman and asked her, "Who is it that lives with you and plays the zither so well?"
"It is a stranger, princess, who arrived yesterday evening," answered
the old woman, and the princess then commanded that the stranger should be brought to her. When he appeared before the princess, she questioned him about his home and his family, and about this and that, and confessed at length that his zither playing gave her great pleasure, and that she would take him for her husband. The stranger replied that it was with that intent he had come. The princess then said, "You must now go to my father and tell him you desire to have me to wife, and when he has put the 3 problems before you, then come back and tell me." The stranger then went straight to the king and told him that he wished to wed his daughter, and the king answered, "I shall be well pleased, provided you can do what I impose upon you. If not, you will lose your head. Now listen. Out there on the ground there lies a thick log, which measures more than 2 fathoms. If you can cleave it in 2 with one stroke of your sword, I will give you my daughter to wife. If you fail, then it will cost you your head." Then the stranger withdrew and returned to the house of the old woman sore distressed, for he could believe nothing but that next day he must atone to the king with his head. And so full was he of the idea of how to set about cleaving the log that he forgot even his zither. In the evening came the princess to the window to listen to his playing, and behold, all was still. Then she called to him, "Why are you so cast down this evening that you do not play on your zither?" And he told her his trouble. But she laughed at it, and called to him, "And you grieve over that? Bring quickly your zither, and play something for my amusement, and early tomorrow come to me." Then the stranger took his zither and played the whole evening for the amusement of the princess. Next morning she took a hair from her locks and gave it to him, saying, "Take this hair and wind it round your sword. Then you will be able to cleave the log in two." Then the stranger went forth, and with one blow cleft the log in two. But the king said, "I will impose another task upon you before you can wed my daughter." "Speak on," said the stranger. "Listen, then," answered the king. "You must mount a horse and ride 3 miles at full gallop, holding in each hand a goblet full of water. If you spill no drop, then I shall give you my daughter to wife. But should you not succeed, then I will take your life." Then the stranger returned to the house of the old woman, and again he was so troubled as to forget his zither. In the evening the princess came to the window as before to listen to the music, but again all was still, and she called to him, "What is the matter that you do not play on your zither?" Then he related all that the king had ordered him to do, and the princess answered, "Do not let yourself be disturbed, only play now, and come to me tomorrow morning." Then next morning he went to her, and she gave him her ring, saying, "Throw this ring into the water, and it will immediately freeze, so that you will not spill any." The stranger did as the princess bade him, and carried the water all the way. Then the king said, "Now I will give you a third task, and this shall be the last. I have a negro who will fight with you tomorrow, and if you are the conqueror you shall wed my daughter." The stranger returned full of joy to the house of the old woman, and that evening was so merry that the princess called to him, "You seem very cheerful this evening. What has my father told you that makes you so glad?" He answered, "Your father has told me that tomorrow I must fight with his negro. He is only another man like myself, and I hope to subdue him and to gain the contest." But the princess answered, "This is the hardest of all. I myself am the black man, for I swallow a drink that changes me into a negro of unconquerable strength. Go tomorrow morning to the market, buy 12 buffalo hides, and wrap them round your horse. Fasten this cloth round you, and when I am let loose upon you tomorrow, show it to me, that I may hold myself back and may not kill you. Then when you fight me, you must try to hit my horse between the eyes, for when you have killed it, you have conquered me." Next morning, therefore, he went to the market and bought the 12 buffalo hides, which he wrapped round his horse. Then he began to fight with the black man, and when the combat had already lasted a long time, and 11 hides were torn, then the stranger hit the negro's horse between the eyes, so that it fell dead, and the black man was defeated. Then said the king, "Because you have solved the 3 problems, I take you for my son-in-law." But the stranger answered, "I have some business to conclude first. In 14 days I will return and bring the bride home." So he arose and went into another country, where he came to a great town, and alighted at the house of an old woman. When he had had supper, he begged of her some water to drink, but she answered,
"My son, I have no water. A giant has taken possession of the spring, and only lets us draw from it once a year, when we bring him a maiden. He eats her up, and then he lets us draw water. Just now it is the lot of the king's daughter, and tomorrow she will be led forth."
The next day, accordingly, the princess was led forth to the spring, and bound there with a golden chain. After that all the people went away, and she was left alone. When they had gone, the stranger went to the maiden and asked her what ailed her that she lamented so much, and she answered that the reason was because the giant would come and eat her up. And the stranger promised that he would set her free if she would take him for her husband, and the princess joyfully consented. When the giant appeared, the stranger set his dog at him, and it took him by the throat and throttled him till he died, so the princess was set free. Now when the king heard of it, he gladly consented to the marriage, and the wedding took place with great rejoicings. The young bridegroom abode in the palace 101 weeks. Then he began to find it too dull, and he desired to go out hunting. The king would fain have prevented it, but in this he could not succeed. Then he begged his son-in-law at least to take sufficient escort with him, but this too the young man evaded, and took only his horse and his dog. He had ridden already a long way when he saw in the distance a hut, and rode straight towards it in order to get some water to drink. There he found an old woman from whom he begged the water. She answered that first he should allow her to beat his dog with her little wand, that it might not bite her while she fetched the water. The hunter consented, and as soon as she had touched the dog with her wand, it immediately turned to stone. Thereupon she touched the hunter and also his horse, and both turned to stone. As soon as that had happened, the cypress trees in front of his father's house began to wither, and when the other brother saw this, he immediately set out in search of his twin. He came first to the town where his brother had slain the giant, and there fate led him to the same old woman where his brother had lodged. When she saw him, she took him for his twin brother, and said to him,
"Do not take it amiss of me, my son, that I did not come to wish you joy on your marriage with the king's daughter."
The stranger perceived what mistake she had made, but only said, "That does not matter, old woman," and rode on, without further speech, to the king's palace, where the king and the princess both took him for his twin brother, and called out, "Why have you tarried so long away? We thought something evil had befallen you." When night came, and he slept with the princess, who still believed him to be her husband, he laid his sword between them, and when morning came he rose early and went out to hunt. Fate led him by the same way which his brother had taken, and from a distance he saw him, and knew that he was turned to stone. Then he entered the hut, and ordered the old woman to disenchant his brother, but she answered,
"Let me first touch your dog with my wand, and then I will free your brother."
He ordered the dog, however, to take hold of her and bite her up to the knee till she cried out,
"Tell your dog to let me go, and I will set your brother free."
But he only answered, "Tell the magic words that I may disenchant him myself," and as she would not, he ordered his dog to bite her up to the hip. Then the old woman cried out,
"I have 2 wands. With the green one I turn to stone, and with the red one I bring to life again."
So the hunter took the red wand and disenchanted his brother, also his brother's horse and his dog, and ordered his own dog to eat the old woman up altogether. While the brothers went on their way back to the castle of the king, the one brother related to the other how the cypress tree had all at once dried up and withered, how he had immediately set out in search of his twin, and how he had come to the castle of his father-in-law and had claimed the princess as his wife. But the other brother became furious on hearing this, and smote him over the forehead till he died, and returned alone to the house of his father-in-law. When night came and he was in bed, the princess asked him, "What was the matter with you last night, that you never spoke a word to me?" Then he cried out, "That was not me, but my brother, and I have slain him, because he told me by the way that he had claimed you for his wife." "Do you know the place where you slew him?" asked the princess, "and can you find the body?" "I know the place exactly." "Then tomorrow we shall ride thither," said the princess. Next morning, accordingly, they set out together, and when they had come to the place, the princess drew forth a small bottle that she had brought with her, and sprinkled the body with some drops of the water, so that immediately he became alive again. When he stood up, his brothers said to him, "Forgive me, dear brother, that I slew you in my anger." Then they embraced, and went together to the fairest in the land, whom the unmarried brother took to wife. Then the brothers brought their parents to live with them, and all dwelt together in joy and happiness. The end. The Unlooked-For Prince, from the Gray Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. A long time ago there lived a king and queen who had no children, although they both wished very much for a little son. They tried not to let each other see how unhappy they were, and pretended to take pleasure in hunting and hawking and all sorts of other sports. But at length the king could bear it no longer, and declared that he must go and visit the furthest corners of his kingdom, and that it would be many months before he should return to his capital. By that time he hoped he would have so many things to think about that he would have forgotten to trouble about the little son who never came. The country the king reigned over was very large, and full of high, stony mountains and sandy deserts, so that it was not at all easy to go from one place to another. One day the king had wandered out alone, meaning to go only a little distance, but everything looked so alike he could not make out the path by which he had come. He walked on and on for hours, the sun beating hotly on his head, and his legs trembling under him, and he might have died of thirst if he had not suddenly stumbled on a little well, which looked as if it had been newly dug. On the surface floated a silver cup with a golden handle, but as it bobbed about whenever the king tried to seize it, he was too thirsty to wait any longer, and knelt down and drank his fill. When he had finished, he began to rise from his knees, but somehow his beard seemed to have stuck fast in the water, and with all his efforts he could not pull it out. After 2 or 3 jerks to his head, which only hurt him without doing any good, he called out angrily, "Let go at once! Who is holding me?" "It is I, the King Kostiei," said a voice from the well, and looking up through the water was a little man with green eyes and a big head. "You have drunk from my spring, and I shall not let you go until you promise to give me the most precious thing your palace contains, which was not there when you left it." Now the only thing that the king much cared for in his palace was the queen herself, and as she was weeping bitterly on a pile of cushions in the great hall when he had ridden away, he knew that Kostiei's words could not apply to her. So he cheerfully gave the promise asked for by the ugly little man, and in the twinkling of an eye man, spring, and cup had disappeared, and the king was left kneeling on the dry sand, wondering if it was all a dream. But as he felt much stronger and better, he made up his mind that this strange adventure must really have happened, and he sprang on his horse and rode off with a light heart to look for his companions. In a few weeks they began to set out on their return home, which they reached one hot day 8 months after they had all left. The king was greatly beloved by his people, and crowds lined the roads, shouting and waving their hats as the procession passed along. On the steps of the palace stood the queen, with a splendid golden cushion in her arms, and on the cushion the most beautiful boy that ever was seen, wrapped about in a cloud of lace. In a moment Kostiei's words rushed into the king's mind, and he began to weep bitterly, to the surprise of everybody who had expected him nearly to die of joy at the sight of his son. But try as he would, and work as hard as he might, he could never forget his promise, and every time he let the baby out of his sight, he thought that he had seen it for the last time. However, years passed on, and the prince grew first into a big boy, and then into a fine young man. Kostiei made no sign, and gradually even the anxious king thought less and less about him, and in the end forgot him altogether. There was no family in the whole kingdom happier than the king and queen and prince, until one day when the youth met a little old man as he was hunting in a lonely part of the woods. "How are you, my unlooked-for prince?" he said. "You kept them waiting a good long time." "And who are you?" asked the prince. "You will know soon enough. When you go home, give my compliments to your father, and tell him that I wish he would square accounts with me. If he neglects to pay his debts, he will bitterly repent it." So saying, the old man disappeared, and the prince returned to the palace and told his father what had happened. The king turned pale and explained to his son the terrible story. "Do not grieve over it, father," answered the Prince. "It is nothing so dreadful after all. I will find some way to force Kostei to give up his rights over me. But if I do not come back in a year's time, you must give up all hopes of ever seeing me." Then the Prince began to prepare for his journey. His father gave him a complete suit of steel armor, a sword, and a horse, while his mother hung round his neck a cross of gold. So, kissing him tenderly, with many tears, they let him go. He rode steadily on for 3 days, and at sunset on the 4th day he found himself on the seashore. On the sand before him lay 12 white dresses, dazzling as the snow, yet as far as his eyes could reach there was no one in sight to whom they could belong. Curious to see what would happen, he took up one of the garments, and leaving his horse loose to wander about the adjoining fields, he hid himself among some willows and waited. In a few minutes a flock of geese, which had been paddling about in the sea, approached the shore, and put on the dresses, struck the sand with their feet, and were transformed in the twinkling of an eye into 11 beautiful young girls, who flew away as fast as they could. The 12th and youngest remained in the water, stretching out her long white neck and looking about her anxiously. Suddenly, among the willows, she perceived the king's son, and called out to him with a human voice, "Oh, Prince, give me back my dress, and I shall be forever grateful to you." The Prince hastened to lay the dress on the sand and walked away. When the maiden had thrown off the goose skin and quickly put on her proper clothes, she came towards him, and he saw that none had ever seen or told of such beauty as hers. She blushed and held out her hand, saying to him in a soft voice, "I thank you, noble Prince, for having granted my request. I am the youngest daughter of Kostei the Immortal, who has 12 daughters and rules over the kingdoms under the earth. Long time my father has waited for you, and great is his anger. But trouble not yourself and fear nothing, only do as I bid you. When you see the King Kostei, fall straightway upon your knees, and heed neither his threats nor his cry, but draw near to him boldly. That which will happen after you will know in time. Now let us go." At these words she struck the ground with her foot, and a gulf opened, down which they went right into the heart of the earth. In a short time they reached Kostei's palace, which gives light, with a light brighter than the sun, to the dark kingdoms below. And the Prince, as he had been bidden, entered boldly into the hall. Kostei, with a shining crown upon his head, sat in the center upon a golden throne. His green eyes glittered like glass. His hands were as the claws of a crab. When he caught sight of the Prince, he uttered piercing yells, which shook the walls of the palace. The Prince took no notice, but continued his advance on his knees towards the throne. When he had almost reached it, the king broke out into a laugh and said, "It has been very lucky for you that you have been able to make me laugh. Stay with us in our underground empire, only first you will have to do 3 things. Tonight it is late. Go to sleep. Tomorrow I will tell you." Early the following morning the Prince received a message that Kostei was ready to see him. He got up and dressed, and hastened to the presence chamber, where the little king was seated on his throne. When the Prince appeared, bowing low before him, Kostei began, "Now, Prince, this is what you have to do. By tonight you must build me a marble palace, with windows of crystal and a roof of gold. It is to stand in the middle of a great park, full of streams and lakes. If you are able to build it, you shall be my friend. If not, off with your head." The Prince listened in silence to this startling speech, and then, returning to his room, set himself to think about the certain death that awaited him. He was quite absorbed in these thoughts when suddenly a bee flew against the window and tapped, saying, "Let me come in." He rose and opened the window, and there stood before him the youngest princess. "What are you dreaming about, Prince?" "I was dreaming of your father, who has planned my death." "Fear nothing. You may sleep in peace, and tomorrow morning when you awake you will find the palace all ready." What she said She did. The next morning, when the prince left his room, he saw before him a palace more beautiful than his fancy had ever pictured. Costier, for his part, could hardly believe his eyes, and pondered deeply how it had got there. "Well, this time you have certainly won, but you are not going to be let off so easily. Tomorrow all my 12 daughters shall stand in a row before you, and if you cannot tell me which of them is the youngest, off goes your head." "What! Not recognize the youngest princess?" said the prince to himself as he entered his room. "A likely story!" "It is such a difficult matter that you will never be able to do it without my help," replied the bee, who was buzzing about the ceiling. "We are all so exactly alike that even our father scarcely knows the difference between us." "Then what must I do?" "This. The youngest is she who will have a ladybird on her eyelid. Be very careful. Now, goodbye." Next morning King Costier again sent for the prince. The young princesses were all drawn up in a row, dressed precisely in the same manner, and with their eyes all cast down. As the prince looked at them, he was amazed at their likeness. Twice he walked along the line without being able to detect the sign agreed upon. The third time his heart beat fast at the sight of a tiny speck upon the eyelid of one of the girls. "This one is the youngest," he said. "How in the world did you guess?" cried Costier in a fury. "There is some jugglery about it. But you are not going to escape me so easily. In 3 hours you shall come here and give me another proof of your cleverness. I shall set alight a handful of straw, and before it is burnt up you will have turned it into a pair of boots. If not, off goes your head." So the prince returned sadly into his room, but the bee was there before him. "Why do you look so melancholy, my handsome prince?" "How can I help looking melancholy when your father has ordered me to make him a pair of boots? Does he take me for a shoemaker?" "What do you think of doing?" "Not of making boots, at any rate. I am not afraid of death. One can only die once, after all." "No, prince, you shall not die. I will try to save you, and we will fly together or die together." As she spoke, she spat upon the ground, and then drawing the prince after her out of the room, she locked the door behind her and threw away the key. Holding each other tight by the hand, they made their way up into the sunlight and found themselves by the side of the same sea, while the prince's horse was still quietly feeding in the neighboring meadow. The moment he saw his master, the horse whinnied and galloped towards him. Without losing an instant, the prince sprang into the saddle, swung the princess behind him, and away they went like an arrow from a bow. When the hour arrived which Costier had fixed for the prince's last trial, and there were no signs of him, the king sent to his room to ask why he delayed so long. The servants, finding the door locked, knocked loudly and received for answer, "In 1 moment." It was the spittle, which was imitating the voice of the prince. The answer was taken back to Costier. He waited, still no prince. He sent the servants back again, and the same voice replied, "Immediately." "He is making fun of me," shrieked Costier in a rage. "Break in the door and bring him to me." The servants hurried to do his bidding. The door was broken open. Nobody inside, but just the spittle in fits of laughter. Costier was beside himself with rage, and commanded his guards to ride after the fugitives. If the guards returned without the fugitives, their heads should pay for it. By this time the prince and princess had got a good start, and were feeling quite happy, when suddenly they heard the sound of a gallop far behind them. The prince sprang from the saddle and laid his ear to the ground. "They are pursuing us," he said. "Then there is no time to be lost," answered the princess, and as she spoke she changed herself into a river, the prince into a bridge, the horse into a crow, and divided the wide road beyond the bridge into 3 little ones. When the soldiers came up to the bridge, they paused uncertainly. How were they to know which of the 3 roads the fugitives had taken? They gave it up in despair and returned in trembling to Costier. "Idiots!" he exclaimed in a passion. "They were the bridge and the river, of course. Do you mean to say you never thought of that? Go back at once." And off they galloped like lightning. But time had been lost, and the prince and princess were far on their way. "I hear a horse!" cried the princess. The prince jumped down and laid his ear to the ground. "Yes," he said, "they are not far off now." In an instant prince, princess, and horse had all disappeared, and instead was a dense forest, crossed and recrossed by countless paths. Coustier's soldiers dashed hastily into the forest, believing they saw before them the flying horse with its double burden. They seemed close upon them, when suddenly horse, wood, everything disappeared, and they found themselves at the place where they started. There was nothing for it but to return to Costier and tell him of this fresh disaster. "A horse! A horse!" cried the king. "I will go after them myself. This time they shall not escape." And he galloped off, foaming with anger. "I think I hear someone pursuing us," said the princess. "Yes, so do I." And this time it is Costier himself. But his power only reaches as far as the first church, and he can go no farther. "Give me your golden cross." So the prince unfastened the cross, which was his mother's gift, and the princess hastily changed herself into a church, the prince into a priest, and the horse into a belfry. It was hardly done when Costier came up. "Greeting, monk. Have you seen some travelers on horseback pass this way?" "Yes, the prince and Costier's daughter have just gone by. They have entered the church, and told me to give you their greetings if I met you." Then Costier knew that he had been hopelessly beaten, and the prince and princess continued their journey without any more adventures. The End. The Daughter of Buk Edemsach, from the Grey Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Once upon a time there lived a man who had 7 daughters. For a long time they dwelt quite happily at home together. Then one morning the father called them all before him and said, "Your mother and I are going on a journey, and as we do not know how long we may be away, you will find enough provisions in the house to last you 3 years. But see you do not open the door to anyone till we come home again." "Very well, dear father," replied the girls. For 2 years they never left the house or unlocked the door. But one day, when they had washed their clothes and were spreading them out on the roof to dry, the girls looked down into the street where people were walking to and fro, and across to the market with its stalls of fresh meat, vegetables, and other nice things. "Come here," cried one. "It makes me quite hungry. Why should not we have our share? Let one of us go to the market and buy meat and vegetables." "Oh, we mustn't do that," said the youngest. "You know our father forbade us to open the door till he came home again." Then the eldest sister sprang at her and struck her. The second spit at her. The third abused her. The fourth pushed her. The fifth flung her to the ground, and the sixth tore her clothes. Then they left her lying on the floor and went out with the basket. In about an hour they came back with the basket full of meat and vegetables, which they put in a pot and set on the fire, quite forgetting that the house door stood wide open. The youngest sister, however, took no part in all this, and when dinner was ready and the table laid, she stole softly out to the entrance hall and hid herself behind a great cask which stood in one corner. Now, while the other sisters were enjoying their feast, a witch passed by, and catching sight of the open door, she walked in. She went up to the eldest girl and said,
"Where shall I begin on you, you fat bolster?"
"You must begin," answered she, "with the hand which struck my little sister." So the witch gobbled her up, and when the last scrap had disappeared, she came to the second and asked,
"Where shall I begin on you, my fat bolster?"
And the second answered, "You must begin on my mouth, which spat on my sister." And so on to the rest, and very soon the whole 6 had disappeared. And as the witch was eating the last mouthful of the last sister, the youngest, who had been crouching frozen with horror behind the barrel, ran out through the open door into the street. Without looking behind her, she hastened on and on, as fast as her feet would carry her, till she saw an ogre's castle standing in front of her. In a corner near the door she spied a large pot, and she crept softly up to it and pulled the cover over it and went to sleep. By and by the ogre came home. "Fee, fo, fum!" cried he. "I smell the smell of a man. What ill fate has brought him here?" And he looked through all the rooms and found nobody. "Where are you?" he called. "Do not be afraid. I will do you no harm." But the girl was still silent. "Come out, I tell you," repeated the ogre. "Your life is quite safe. If you are an old man, you shall be my father. If you are a boy, you shall be my son. If your years are as many as mine, you shall be my brother. If you are an old woman, you shall be my mother. If you are a young one, you shall be my daughter. If you are middle-aged, you shall be my wife. So come out, and fear nothing." Then the maiden came out of her hiding-place and stood before him. "Fear nothing," said the ogre again, and when he went away to hunt he left her to look after the house. In the evening he returned, bringing with him hares, partridges, and gazelles for the girl's supper. For himself he only cared for the flesh of men, which she cooked for him. He also gave into her charge the keys of 6 rooms, but the key of the 7th he kept himself. And time passed on, and the girl and the ogre still lived together. She called him father, and he called her daughter, and never once did he speak roughly to her. One day the maiden said to him, "Father, give me the key of the upper chamber." "No, my daughter," replied the ogre, "there is nothing there that is any use to you." "But I want the key," she repeated again. However, the ogre took no notice and pretended not to hear. The girl began to cry and said to herself, "Tonight, when he thinks I am asleep, I will watch and see where he hides it." And after she and the ogre had supped, she bade him good night and left the room. In a few minutes she stole quietly back and watched from behind a curtain. In a little while she saw the ogre take the key from his pocket and hide it in a hole in the ground before he went to bed. And when all was still, she took out the key and went back to the house. The next morning the ogre awoke with the first ray of light, and the first thing he did was to look for the key. It was gone, and he guessed at once what had become of it. But instead of getting into a great rage, as most ogres would have done, he said to himself, "If I wake the maiden up, I shall only frighten her, for today she shall keep the key, and when I return tonight it will be time enough to take it from her." So he went off to hunt. The moment he was safe out of the way, the girl ran upstairs and opened the door of the room, which was quite bare. The one window was closed, and she threw back the lattice and looked out. Beneath lay a garden which belonged to the prince, and in the garden was an ox, who was drawing up water from the well all by himself, for there was nobody to be seen anywhere. The ox raised his head at the noise the girl made in opening the lattice, and said to her,
"Good morning, O daughter of Buk Ettemsuch. Your father is feeding you up till you are nice and fat, and then he will put you on a spit and cook you."
These words so frightened the maiden that she burst into tears and ran out of the room. All day she wept, and when the ogre came home at night, no supper was ready for him. "What are you crying for?" said he. "Where is my supper? And is it you who have opened the upper chamber?" "Yes, I opened it," answered she. "And what did the ox say to you?" "He said, 'Good morning, O daughter of Buk Ettemsuch. Your father is feeding you up till you are nice and fat, and then he will put you on a spit and cook you.'" "Well, tomorrow you can go to the window and say, 'My father is feeding me up till I am nice and fat, but he does not mean to eat me. If I had one of your eyes, I would use it for a mirror, and look at myself before and behind, and your girths should be loosened, and you should be blind 7 days and 7 nights." "All right," replied the girl, and the next morning when the ox spoke to her, she answered him as she had been told, and he fell down straight upon the ground, and lay there 7 days and 7 nights. But the flowers in the garden withered, for there was no one to water them. When the prince came into his garden, he found nothing but yellow stalks. In the midst of them the ox was lying. With a blow from his sword he killed the animal, and turning to his attendants he said, "Go and fetch another ox." And they brought in a great beast, and he drew the water out of the well, and the flowers revived, and the grass grew green again. Then the prince called his attendants and went away. The next morning the girl heard the noise of the water wheel, and she opened the lattice and looked out of the window.
"Good morning, O daughter of Buk Ettemsuch," said the new ox. "Your father is feeding you up till you are nice and fat, and then he will put you on a spit and cook you."
And the maiden answered, "My father is feeding me up till I am nice and fat, but he does not mean to eat me. If I had one of your eyes, I would use it for a mirror, and look at myself before and behind, and your girths should be loosened, and you should be blind 7 days and 7 nights." Directly she uttered these words, the ox fell to the ground and lay there 7 days and 7 nights. Then he arose and began to draw the water from the well. He had only turned the wheel once or twice when the prince took it into his head to visit his garden and see how the new ox was getting on. When he entered, the ox was working busily, but in spite of that the flowers and grass were dried up, and the prince drew his sword and rushed at the ox to slay him, as he had done the other. But the ox fell on his knees and said, "My lord, only spare my life, and let me tell you how it happened." "How what happened?" asked the prince. "My lord, a girl looked out of that window and spoke a few words to me, and I fell to the ground. For 7 days and 7 nights I lay there, unable to move. But, oh, my lord, it is not given to us twice to behold beauty such as hers." "It is a lie," said the prince. "An ogre dwells there. It is likely that he keeps a maiden in his upper chamber." "Why not?" replied the ox. "But if you come here at dawn tomorrow and hide behind that tree, you will see for yourself." "So I will," said the prince, "and if I find that you have not spoken truth, I will kill you." The prince left the garden, and the ox went on with his work. Next morning the prince came early to the garden, and found the ox busy with the water wheel. "Has the girl appeared yet?" he asked. "Not yet, but she will not be long. Hide yourself in the branches of that tree, and you will soon see her." The prince did as he was told, and scarcely was he seated when the maiden threw open the lattice. "Good morning, O daughter of Buk Ettemsuch," said the ox. "Your father is feeding you up till you are nice and fat, and then he will put you on a spit and cook you." "My father is feeding me up till I am nice and fat, but he does not mean to eat me. If I had one of your eyes, I would use it for a mirror, and look at myself before and behind, and your girths should be loosened, and you should be blind 7 days and 7 nights." And hardly had she spoken when the ox fell on the ground, and the maiden shut the lattice and went away. But the prince knew that what the ox had said was true, and that she had not her equal in the whole world, and he came down from the tree, his heart burning with love. "Why has the ogre not eaten her?" thought he. "This night I will invite him to supper in my palace, and question him about the maiden, and find out if she is his wife." So the prince ordered a great ox to be slain and roasted whole, and 2 huge tanks to be made, one filled with water and the other with wine. And towards evening he called his attendants and went to the ogre's house to wait in the courtyard till he came back from hunting. The ogre was surprised to see so many people assembled in front of his house, but he bowed politely and said, "Good morning, dear neighbors. To what do I owe the pleasure of this visit? I have not offended you, I hope." "Oh, certainly not," answered the prince. "Then," continued the ogre, "what has brought you to my house today for the first time?" "We should like to have supper with you," said the prince. "Well, supper is ready, and you are welcome," replied the ogre, leading the way into the house, for he had had a good day, and there was plenty of game in the bag over his shoulder. A table was quickly prepared, and the prince had already taken his place when he suddenly exclaimed, "After all, Buk Ettemsuch, suppose you come to supper with me." "Where?" asked the ogre. "In my house. I know it is all ready, but it is so far off. Why not stay here?" "Oh, I will come another day, but this evening I must be your host." So the ogre accompanied the prince and his attendants back to the palace. After a while the prince turned to the ogre and said, "It is as a wooer that I appear before you. I seek a wife from an honorable family."
"But I have no daughter," replied the ogre.
"Oh, yes, you have. I saw her at the window."
"Well, you can marry her if you wish," said he.
So the prince's heart was glad as he and his attendants rode back with the ogre to his house, and as they parted the prince said to his guest, "You will not forget the bargain we have made."
"I am not a young man, and never break my promises," said the ogre, and went in and shut the door.
Upstairs he found the maiden waiting till he returned to have her supper, for she did not like eating by herself.
"I have had my supper," said the ogre, "for I have been spending the evening with the prince."
"Where did you meet him?" asked the girl.
"Oh, we are neighbors and grew up together, and tonight I promised that you should be his wife."
"I don't want to be any man's wife," answered she, but this was only pretense, for her heart too was glad. Next morning early came the prince, bringing with him bridal gifts and splendid wedding garments to carry the maiden back to his palace. But before he let her go the ogre called her to him and said,
"Be careful, girl, never to speak to the prince, and when he speaks to you, you must be dumb, unless he swears by the head of Buk Ettemsuch. Then you may speak."
"Very well," answered the girl. They set out, and when they reached the palace the prince led his bride to the room he had prepared for her, and said, "Speak to me, my wife." But she was silent, and by he left her, thinking that perhaps she was shy. The next day the same thing happened, and the next. At last he said, "Well, if you won't speak, I shall go and get another wife who will." And he did. Now when the new wife was brought to the palace, the daughter of Buk Ettemsuch rose, and spoke to the ladies who had come to attend on the second bride. "Go and sit down. I will make ready the feast." And the ladies sat down as they were told, and waited. The maiden sat down too, and called out, "Come here, firewood." And the firewood came. "Come here, fire." And the fire came, and kindled the wood. "Come here, pot." "Come here, oil." And the pot and the oil came. "Get into the pot, oil," said she, and the oil did it. When the oil was boiling, the maiden dipped all her fingers in it, and they became 10 fried fishes. "Come here, oven," she cried next, and the oven came. "Fire, heat the oven." And the fire heated it. When it was hot enough, the maiden jumped in, just as she was, with her beautiful silver and gold dress and all her jewels. In a minute or two she had turned into a snow-white loaf that made your mouth water. Said the loaf to the ladies, "You can eat now. Do not stand so far off." But they only stared at each other, speechless with surprise. "What are you staring at?" asked the new bride. "At all these wonders," replied the ladies. "Do you call these wonders?" said she scornfully. "I can do that too." And she jumped straight into the oven and was burnt up in a moment. Then they ran to the prince and said, "Come quickly, your wife is dead." "Bury her then," returned he. "But why did she do it? I am sure I said nothing to make her throw herself into the oven." Accordingly the burnt woman was buried, but the prince would not go to the funeral, as all his thoughts were still with the wife who would not speak to him. The next night he said to her, "Dear wife, are you afraid that something dreadful will happen if you speak to me? If you still persist in being dumb, I shall be forced to get another wife." The poor girl longed to speak, But dread of the ogre kept her silent, and the prince did as he had said, and brought a fresh bride into the palace. And when she and her ladies were seated in state, the maiden planted a sharp stake in the ground, and sat herself down comfortably on it, and began to spin. "What are you staring at so?" said the new bride to her ladies. "Do you think that is anything wonderful? Why, I can do as much myself." "I am sure you can't," said they, much too surprised to be polite. Then the maid sprang off the stake and left the room, and instantly the new wife took her place. But the sharp stake ran through, and she was dead in a moment. So they sent to the prince and said, "Come quickly and bury your wife." "Bury her yourselves," he answered. "What did she do it for? It was not by my orders that she impaled herself on the stake." So they buried her, and in the evening the prince came to the daughter of Buk Ettemsuch and said to her, "Speak to me, or I shall have to take another wife." But she was afraid to speak to him. The following day the prince hid himself in the room and watched, and soon the maiden woke, and said to the pitcher and to the water jug, "Quick, go down to the spring and bring me some water, I am thirsty." And they went. But as they were filling themselves at the spring, the water jug knocked against the pitcher and broke off its spout, and the pitcher burst into tears and ran to the maiden and said, "Mistress, beat the water jug, for he has broken my spout." "By the head of Buk Ettemsuch, I implore you not to beat me." "Ah," she replied, "if only my husband had sworn by that oath, I could have spoken to him from the beginning, and he need never have taken another wife. But now he will never say it, and he will have to go on marrying fresh ones." And the prince from his hiding-place heard her words, and he jumped up and ran to her and said, "By the head of Buk Ettemsuch, speak to me." So she spoke to him, and they lived happily to the end of their days, because the girl kept the promise she had made to the ogre. The End. A Fairy's Blunder, from the Grey Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Once upon a time there lived a fairy whose name was Dindonette. She was the best creature in the world, with the kindest heart, but she had not much sense, and was always doing things to benefit people, which generally ended in causing pain and distress to everybody concerned. No one knew this better than the inhabitants of an island far off in the midst of the sea, which, according to the laws of Fairyland, she had taken under her special protection, thinking day and night of what she could do to make the isle the pleasantest place in the whole world, as it was the most beautiful. Now, what happened was this. As the fairy went about unseen from house to house, she heard everywhere children longing for the time when they would be grown up and able, they thought, to do as they liked, and old people talking about the past and sighing to be young again. "Is there no way of satisfying these poor things?" she thought, and then one night an idea occurred to her. "Oh, yes, of course. It has been tried before, but I will manage better than the rest, with their old fountain of youth, which, after all, only made people young again. I will enchant the spring that bubbles up in the middle of the orchard, and the children that drink of it shall at once become grown men and women, and the old people return to the days of their childhood." And without stopping to consult one single other fairy who might have given her good advice, off rushed Dindonette to cast her spell over the fountain. It was the only spring of fresh water in the island, and at dawn was crowded with people of all ages come to drink at its source. Delighted at her plan for making them all happy, the fairy hid herself behind a thicket of roses and peeped out whenever footsteps came that way. It was not long before she had ample proof of the success of her enchantments. Almost before her eyes the children put on the size and strength of adults, while the old men and women instantly became helpless tiny babies. Indeed, so pleased was she with the result of her work that she could no longer remain hidden, and went about telling everybody what she had done and enjoying their gratitude and thanks. But after the first outburst of delight at their wishes being granted, people began to be a little frightened at the rapid effects of the magic water. It was delicious to feel yourself at the height of your power and beauty, but you would wish to keep so always. Now this was exactly what the fairy had been in too much of a hurry to arrange, and no sooner had the children become grown up and the men and women become babies than they all rushed on to old age at an appalling rate. The fairy only found out her mistake when it was too late to set it right. When the inhabitants of the island saw what had befallen them, they were filled with despair, and did everything they could think of to escape from such a dreadful fate. They dug wells in their places so that they should no longer need to drink from the magic spring, but the sandy soil yielded no water, and the rainy season was already past. They stored up the dew that fell, and the juice of fruits and of herbs, but all this was as a drop in the ocean of their wants. Some threw themselves into the sea, trusting that the current might carry them to other shores. They had no boats, and a few, still more impatient, put themselves to death on the spot. The rest submitted blindly to their destiny. Perhaps the worst part of the enchantment was that the change from one age to another was so rapid that the person had no time to prepare himself for it. It would not have mattered so much if the man who stood up in the assembly of the nation to give his advice as to peace or war had looked like a baby, as long as he spoke with the knowledge and sense of a full-grown man. But alas! With the outward form of an infant, he had taken on its helplessness and foolishness, and there was no one who could train him to better things. The end of it all was that before a month had passed the population had died out, and the fairy Dindonette, ashamed and grieved at the effects of her folly, had left the island forever. Many centuries after, the fairy Selnozoura, who had fallen into bad health, was ordered by her doctors to make the tour of the world twice a week for change of air, and in one of these journeys she found herself at Fountain Island. Selnozoura never made these trips alone, but always took with her 2 children of whom she was very fond. Cornichon, a boy of 14, bought in his childhood at a slave market, and Toupette, a few months younger, who had been entrusted to the care of the fairy by her guardian, the genius Kristopo. Cornichon and Toupette were intended by Selnozoura to become husband and wife as soon as they were old enough. Meanwhile they traveled with her in a little vessel, whose speed through the air was just 1,950 times greater than that of the swiftest of our ships. Struck with the beauty of the island, Selnozoura ran the vessel to ground, and leaving it in the care of the dragon which lived in the hold during the voyage, stepped on shore with her 2 companions. Surprised at the sight of a large town whose streets and houses were absolutely desolate, the fairy resolved to put her magic arts in practice to find out the cause. While she was thus engaged, Cornichon and Toupette wandered away by themselves, and by arrived at the fountain, whose bubbling waters looked cool and delicious on such a hot day. Scarcely had they each drunk a deep draught, when the fairy, who by this time had discovered all she wished to know, hastened to the spot. "Oh, beware, beware!" she cried, the moment she saw them. "If you drink that deadly poison, you will be ruined forever." "Poison?" answered Toupette. "It is the most refreshing water I have ever tasted, and Cornichon will say so too." "Unhappy children, then I am too late. Why did you leave me? Listen, and I will tell you what has befallen the wretched inhabitants of this island, and what will befall you too. The power of fairies is great," she added, when she had finished her story, "but they cannot destroy the work of another fairy. Very shortly you will pass into the weakness and silliness of extreme old age, and all I can do for you is to make it as easy to you as possible, and to preserve you from the death that others have suffered from having no one to look after them. But the charm is working already. Cornichon is taller and more manly than he was an hour ago, and Toupette no longer looks like a little girl." It was true, but this fact did not seem to render the young people as miserable as it did Selnozoura. "Do not pity us," said Cornichon. "If we are fated to grow old so soon, let us no longer delay our marriage. What matter if we anticipate our decay, if we only anticipate our happiness too?" The fairy felt that Cornichon had reason on his side, and seeing by a glance at Toupette's face that there was no opposition to be feared from her, she answered,
"Let it be so, then, but not in this dreadful place. We will return at once to Bogota, and the festivities shall be the most brilliant ever seen."
They all returned to the vessel, and in a few hours the 4,500 miles that lay between the island and Bogota were passed. Everyone was surprised to see the change which the short absence had made in the young people, but as the fairy had promised absolute silence about the adventure, they were none the wiser, and busied themselves in preparing their dresses for the marriage, which was fixed for the next night. Early on the following morning the genius Kristopo arrived at the court on one of the visits he was in the habit of paying his ward from time to time. Like the rest, he was astonished at the sudden improvement in the child. He had always been fond of her, and in a moment he fell violently in love. Hastily demanding an audience of the fairy, he laid his proposals before her, never doubting that she would give her consent to so brilliant a match. But Selnozoura refused to listen, and even hinted that in his own interest Kristopo had better turn his thoughts elsewhere. The genius pretended to agree, but instead he went straight to Toupette's room, and flew away with her through the window, at the very instant that the bridegroom was awaiting her below. When the fairy discovered what had happened, she was furious, and sent messenger after messenger to the genius in his palace at Ratibouf, commanding him to restore Toupette without delay, and threatening to make war in case of refusal. Kristopo gave no direct answer to the fairy's envoys, but kept Toupette closely guarded in a tower, where the poor girl used all her powers of persuasion to induce him to put off their marriage. All would, however, have been quite vain if, in the course of a few days, sorrow, joined to the spell of the magic water, had not altered her appearance so completely that Kristopo was quite alarmed, and declared that she needed amusement and fresh air, and that, as his presence seemed to distress her, she should be left her own mistress. But one thing he declined to do, and that was to send her back to Bogota. In the meantime both sides had been busily collecting armies, and Kristopo had given the command of his to a famous general, while Selnozoura had placed Cornichon at the head of her forces. But before war was actually declared, Toupette's parents, who had been summoned by the genius, arrived at Ratibouf. They had never seen their daughter since they parted from her as a baby, but from time to time travelers to Bogota had brought back accounts of her beauty. What was their amazement, therefore, at finding, instead of a lovely girl, a middle-aged woman, handsome indeed, but quite faded, looking in fact older than themselves. Kristopo, hardly less astonished than they were at the sudden change, thought that it was a joke on the part of one of his courtiers, who had hidden Toupette away and put this elderly lady in her place. Bursting with rage, he sent instantly for all the servants and guards of the town, and inquired who had the insolence to play him such a trick, and what had become of their prisoner. They replied that since Toupette had been in their charge she had never left her rooms unveiled, and that during her walks in the surrounding gardens her food had been brought in and placed on her table. As she preferred to eat alone, no one had ever seen her face, or knew what she was like. The servants were clearly speaking the truth, and Kristopo was obliged to believe them. But, thought he, if they have not had a hand in this, it must be the work of the fairy, and in his anger he ordered the army to be ready to march. On her side, Selnozoura of course knew what the genius had to expect, but was deeply offended when she heard of the base trick which she was believed to have invented. Her first desire was to give battle to Kristopo at once, but with great difficulty her ministers induced her to pause, and to send an ambassador to Kristopo to try to arrange matters. So the Prince Zepredy departed for the court of Ratibouf, and on his way he met Cornichon, who was encamped with his army just outside the gates of Bogota. The prince showed him the fairy's written order that for the present peace must still be kept, and Cornichon, filled with longing to see Toupette once more, begged to be allowed to accompany Zeprady on his mission to Ratibouf. By this time the genius's passion for Toupette, which had caused all these troubles, had died out, and he willingly accepted the terms of peace offered by Zeprady, though he informed the prince that he still believed the fairy to be guilty of the dreadful change in the girl. To this the prince only replied that on that point he had a witness who could prove better than anyone else if it was Toupette or not, and desired that Cornichon should be sent for. When Toupette was told that she was to see her old lover again, her heart leapt with joy, but soon the recollection came to her of all that had happened, and she remembered that Cornichon would be changed as well as she. The moment of their meeting was not all happiness, especially on the part of Toupette, who could not forget her lost beauty, and the genius who was present was at last convinced that he had not been deceived, and went out to sign the treaty of peace, followed by his attendants. "Ah, Toupette, my dear Toupette!" cried Cornichon, as soon as they were left alone. "Now that we are once more united, let our past troubles be forgotten." "Our past troubles!" answered she, "and what do you call our lost beauty and the dreadful future before us? You are looking 50 years older than when I saw you last, and I know too well that fate has treated me no better." "Ah, do not say that," replied Cornichon, clasping her hand. "You are different, it is true, but every age has its graces, and surely no woman of 60 was ever handsomer than you. If your eyes had been as bright as of yore, they would have matched badly with your faded skin. The wrinkles which I notice on your forehead explain the increased fullness of your cheeks, and your throat in withering is elegant in decay. Thus the harmony shown by your features, even as they grow old, is the best proof of their former beauty." "Oh, monster!" cried Toupette, bursting into tears. "Is that all the comfort you can give me?" "But, Toupette," answered Cornichon, "you used to declare that you did not care for beauty as long as you had my heart." "Yes, I know," said she, "but how can you go on caring for a person who is as old and plain as I?" "Toupette, Toupette," replied Cornichon, "you are only talking nonsense. My heart is as much yours as ever it was, and nothing in the world can make any difference." At this point of the conversation the Prince Zeprady entered the room, with the news that the genius, full of regret for his behaviour, had given Cornichon full permission to depart for Pagoda as soon as he liked, and to take Toupette with him, adding that, though he begged that they would excuse his taking leave of them before they went, he hoped before long to visit them at Pagoda. Neither of the lovers slept that night, Cornichon from joy at returning home, Toupette from dread of the blow to her vanity which awaited her at Pagoda. It was hopeless for Cornichon to try to console her during the journey with the reasons he had given the day before. She only grew worse and worse, and when they reached the palace went straight to her old apartments, entreating the fairy to allow both herself and Cornichon to remain concealed and to see no one. For some time after their arrival the fairy was taken up with the preparations for the rejoicings which were to celebrate the peace, and with the reception of the genius, who was determined to do all in his power to regain Selnozoura's lost friendship. Cornichon and Toupette were therefore left entirely to themselves, and though this was only what they wanted, still they began to feel a little neglected. At length, one morning, they saw from the windows that the fairy and the genius were approaching, in state, with all their courtiers in attendance. Toupette instantly hid herself in the darkest corner of the room, but Cornichon, forgetting that he was now no longer a boy of 14, ran to meet them. In so doing he tripped and fell, bruising one of his eyes severely. At the sight of her lover lying helpless on the floor, Toupette hastened to his side, but her feeble legs gave way under her, and she fell almost on top of him, knocking out 3 of her loosened teeth against his forehead. The fairy, who entered the room at this moment, burst into tears, and listened in silence to the genius, who hinted that by and by everything would be put right. "At the last assembly of the fairies," he said, "when the doings of each fairy were examined and discussed, a proposal was made to lessen as far as possible the mischief caused by Dindonette by enchanting the fountain. And it was decided that as she had meant nothing but kindness, she should have the power of undoing one half of the spell. Of course, she might always have destroyed the fatal fountain, which would have been best of all, but this she never thought of. Yet, in spite of this, her heart is so good that I am sure that the moment she hears that she is wanted she will fly to help. Only before she comes, it is for you, madam, to make up your mind which of the two shall regain their former strength and beauty." At these words the fairy's soul sank. Both Cornichon and Toupette were equally dear to her, and how could she favor one at the cost of the other? As to the courtiers, none of the men were able to understand why she hesitated a second to declare for Toupette, while the ladies were equally strong on the side of Cornichon. But, however undecided the fairy might be, it was quite different with Cornichon and Toupette. "Ah, my love," exclaimed Cornichon, "at length I shall be able to give you the best proof of my devotion by showing you how I value the beauties of your mind above those of your body. While the most charming women of the court will fall victims to my youth and strength, I shall think of nothing but how to lay them at your feet and pay heartfelt homage to your age and wrinkles." "Not so fast," interrupted Toupette. "I don't see why you should have it all. Why do you heap such humiliations upon me? But I will trust to the justice of the fairy, who will not treat me so." Then she entered her own rooms and refused to leave them, in spite of the prayers of Cornichon, who begged her to let him explain. No one at the court thought or spoke of any other subject during the few days before the arrival of Dindonette, whom everybody expected to set things right in a moment. But alas, she had no idea herself what was best to be done, and always adopted the opinion of the person she was talking to. At length a thought struck her, which seemed the only way of satisfying both parties, and she asked the fairy to call together all the court and the people to hear her decision. "Happy is he," she began, "who can repair the evil he has caused, but happier he who has never caused any." As nobody contradicted this remark, she continued, "To me it is only allowed to undo one half of the mischief I have wrought. I could restore you your youth," she said to Cornichon, "or your beauty," turning to Toupette. "I will do both, and I will do neither." A murmur of curiosity arose from the crowd, while Cornichon and Toupette trembled with astonishment. "No," went on Dindonette, "never should I have the cruelty to leave one of you to decay, while the other enjoys the glory of youth. And as I cannot restore you both at once to what you were, one half of each of your bodies shall become young again, while the other half goes on its way to decay. I will leave it to you to choose which half it shall be. If I shall draw a line around the waist, or a line straight down the middle of the body." She looked about her proudly, expecting applause for her clever idea. But Cornichon and Toupette were shaking with rage and disappointment, and everyone else broke into shouts of laughter. In pity for the unhappy lovers, Selnozoura came forward.
"Do you not think," she said, "that instead of what you propose, it would be better to let them take it in turns to enjoy their former youth and beauty for a fixed time? I am sure you could easily manage that."
"What an excellent notion!" cried Dindonette. "Oh, yes, of course, that is best. Which of you shall I touch first?" "Touch her," replied Cornichon, who was always ready to give way to Toupette. "I know her heart too well to fear any change." So the fairy bent forward and touched her with her magic ring, and in one instant the old woman was a girl again. The whole court wept with joy at the sight, and Toupette ran up to Cornichon, who had fallen down in his surprise, promising to pay him long visits and tell him of all her balls and water parties. The two fairies went to their own apartments, where the genius followed them to take his leave. "Oh dear!" suddenly cried Dindonette, breaking into the farewell speech of the genius. "I quite forgot to fix the time when Cornichon should in his turn grow young. How stupid of me! And now I fear it is too late, for I ought to have declared it before I touched Toupette with the ring. Oh dear! Oh dear! Why did nobody warn me?" "You were so quick," replied Selnozoura, who had long been aware of the mischief the fairy had again done, "and we can only wait now till Cornichon shall have reached the utmost limits of his decay, when he will drink of the water and become a baby once more, so that Toupette will have to spend her life as a nurse, a wife, and a caretaker." After the anxiety of mind and the weakness of body to which for so long Toupette had been a prey, it seemed as if she could not amuse herself enough, and it was seldom indeed that she found time to visit poor Cornichon, though she did not cease to be fond of him or to be kind to him. Still, she was perfectly happy without him, and this the poor man did not fail to see, almost blind and deaf from age though he was. But it was left to Kristopo to undo at last the work of Dindonette, and give Cornichon back the youth he had lost, and this the genius did all the more gladly, as he discovered quite by accident that Cornichon was in fact his son. It was on this plea that he attended the great yearly meeting of the fairies, and prayed that, in consideration of his services to so many of the members, this one boon might be granted him. Such a request had never before been heard in Fairyland, and was objected to by some of the older fairies, but both Kristopo and Selnozoura were held in such high honor that the murmurs of disgust were set aside, and the latest victim to the enchanted fountain was pronounced to be free of the spell. All that the genius asked in return was that he might accompany the fairy back to Pagoda, and be present when his son assumed his proper shape. They made up their minds they would just tell Toupette that they had found a husband for her, and give her a pleasant surprise at her wedding, which was fixed for the following night. She heard the news with astonishment, and many pangs for the grief which Cornichon would certainly feel at his place being taken by another. But she did not dream of disobeying the fairy, and spent the whole day wondering who the bridegroom could be. At the appointed hour a large crowd assembled at the fairy's palace, which was decorated with the sweetest flowers known only to Fairyland. Toupette had taken her place, but where was the bridegroom? "Fetch Cornichon," said the fairy to her chamberlain, but Toupette interposed. "Oh, madam, spare him, I entreat you, this bitter pain, and let him remain hidden and in peace." "It is necessary that he should be here," answered the fairy, "and he will not regret it." And as she spoke, Cornichon was led in, smiling with the foolishness of extreme old age at the sight of the gay crowd. "Bring him here," commanded the fairy, waving her hand towards Toupette, who started back from surprise and horror. Selnozoura then took the hand of the poor old man, and the genius came forward and touched him 3 times with his ring, when Cornichon was transformed into a handsome young man. "May you live long," the genius said, "to enjoy happiness with your wife, and to love your father." And that was the end of the mischief wrought by the fairy Dindonette. The End. Cannetella, from the Grey Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. There was once upon a time a king who reigned over a country called Bello Puojo. He was very rich and powerful, and had everything in the world he could desire except a child. But at last, after he had been married for many years, and was quite an old man, his wife Renzolla presented him with a fine daughter, whom they called Cannetella. She grew up into a beautiful girl, and was as tall and straight as a young fir tree. When she was 18 years old, her father called her to him and said, "You are of an age now, my daughter, to marry and settle down. But as I love you more than anything else in the world, and desire nothing but your happiness, I am determined to leave the choice of a husband to yourself. Choose a man after your own heart, and you are sure to satisfy me." Cannetella thanked her father very much for his kindness and consideration, but told him that she had not the slightest wish to marry, and was quite determined to remain single. The king, who felt himself growing old and feeble, and longed to see an heir to the throne before he died, was very unhappy at her words, and begged her earnestly not to disappoint him. When Cannetella saw that the king had set his heart on her marriage, she said, "Very well, dear father, I will marry to please you, for I do not wish to appear ungrateful for all your love and kindness. But you must find me a husband handsomer, cleverer, and more charming than anyone else in the world." The king was overjoyed by her words, and from early in the morning till late at night he sat at the window and looked carefully at all the passers-by, in the hopes of finding a son-in-law among them. One day, seeing a very good-looking man crossing the street, the king called his daughter and said, "Come quickly, dear Cantanella, and look at this man, for I think he might suit you as a husband." They called the young man into the palace, and set a sumptuous feast before him, with every sort of delicacy you can imagine. In the middle of the meal the youth let an almond fall out of his mouth, which, however, he picked up again very quickly, and hid under the tablecloth. When the feast was over, the stranger went away, and the king asked Cantanella, "Well, what did you think of the youth?" "I think he was a clumsy wretch," replied Cantanella. "Fancy a man of his age letting an almond fall out of his mouth." When the king heard her answer, he returned to his watch at the window, and shortly afterwards a very handsome young man passed by. The king instantly called his daughter to come and see what she thought of the newcomer. "Call him in," said Cantanella, "that we may see him close." Another splendid feast was prepared, and when the stranger had eaten and drunk as much as he was able, and had taken his departure, the king asked Cantanella how she liked him. "Not at all," replied his daughter. "What could you do with a man who requires at least 2 servants to help him on with his cloak, because he is too awkward to put it on properly himself?" "If that's all you have against him," said the king, "I see how the land lies. You are determined not to have a husband at all, but marry someone you shall, for I do not mean my name and house to die out." "Well, then, my dear parent," said Cantanella, "I must tell you at once that you had better not count upon me, for I never mean to marry unless I can find a man with a gold head and gold teeth." The king was very angry at finding his daughter so obstinate, but as he always gave the girl her own way in everything, he issued a proclamation to the effect that any man with a gold head and gold teeth might come forward and claim the princess as his bride, and the kingdom of Bello Puojo as a wedding gift. Now the king had a deadly enemy called Sciaravante, who was a very powerful magician. No sooner had this man heard of the proclamation than he summoned his attendant spirits and commanded them to gild his head and teeth. The spirits said at first that the task was beyond their powers, and suggested that a pair of golden horns attached to his forehead would both be easier to make and more comfortable to wear, but Sciaravante would allow no compromise, and insisted on having a head and teeth made of the finest gold. When it was fixed on his shoulders, he went for a stroll in front of the palace, and the king, seeing the very man he was in search of, called his daughter and said, "Just look out of the window, and you will find exactly what you want." Then, as Sciaravante was hurrying past, the king shouted out to him, "Just stop a minute, brother, and don't be in such desperate haste. If you will step in here, you shall have my daughter for a wife, and I will send attendants with her, and as many horses and servants as you wish." "1,000 thanks," returned Sciaravante. "I shall be delighted to marry your daughter, but it is quite unnecessary to send anyone to accompany her. Give me a horse, and I will carry off the princess in front of my saddle, and will bring her to my own kingdom, where there is no lack of courtiers or servants, or indeed of anything your daughter can desire." At first the king was very much against Cannetella's departing in this fashion, but finally Sciaravante got his way, and placing the princess before him on his horse, he set out for his own country. Towards evening he dismounted, and entering a stable he placed Cannetella in the same stall as his horse, and said to her, "Now listen to what I have to say. I am going to my home now, and that is a 7 years' journey from here. You must wait for me in this stable, and never move from the spot, or let yourself be seen by a living soul. If you disobey my commands, it will be the worse for you." The princess answered meekly, "Sir, I am your servant, and will do exactly as you bid me, but I should like to know what I am to live on till you come back." "You can take what the horses leave," was Scioravante's reply. When the magician had left her, Cannetella felt very miserable, and bitterly cursed the day she was born. She spent all her time weeping and bemoaning the cruel fate that had driven her from a palace into a stable, from soft down cushions to a bed of straw, and from the dainties of her father's table to the food that the horses left. She led this wretched life for a few months, and during that time she never saw who fed and watered the horses, for it was all done by invisible hands. One day, when she was more than usually unhappy, she perceived a little crack in the wall, through which she could see a beautiful garden, with all manner of delicious fruits and flowers growing in it. The sight and smell of such delicacies were too much for poor Cannetella, and she said to herself, "I will slip quietly out and pick a few oranges and grapes, and I don't care what happens. Who is there to tell my husband what I do? And even if he should hear of my disobedience, he cannot make my life more miserable than it is already." So she slipped out and refreshed her poor starved body with the fruit she plucked in the garden. But a short time afterwards her husband returned unexpectedly, and one of the horses instantly told him that Cannetella had gone into the garden in his absence and had stolen some oranges and grapes. Scioravante was furious when he heard this, and seizing a huge knife from his pocket, he threatened to kill his wife for her disobedience. But Cannetella threw herself at his feet and implored him to spare her life, saying that hunger drove even the wolf from the wood. At last she succeeded in so far softening her husband's heart that he said, "I will forgive you this time and spare your life, but if you disobey me again, and I hear on my return that you have as much as moved out of the stall, I will certainly kill you. So beware, for I am going away once more, and shall be absent for 7 years." With these words he took his departure, and Cannetella burst into a flood of tears, and wringing her hands she moaned, "Why was I ever born to such a hard fate? Oh, father, how miserable you have made your poor daughter!" But why should I blame my father? For I have only myself to thank for all my sufferings. I got the cursed head of gold, and it has brought all this misery on me. I am indeed punished for not doing as my father wished. When a year had gone by, it chanced one day that the king's cooper passed the stables where Cannetella was kept prisoner. She recognized the man and called him to come in. At first he did not know the poor princess, and could not make out who it was that called him by name. But when he heard Cannetella's tale of woe, he hid her in a big empty barrel he had with him, partly because he was sorry for the poor girl, and even more because he wished to gain the king's favor. Then he slung the barrel on a mule's back, and in this way the princess was carried to her own home. They arrived at the palace about 4 o'clock in the morning, and the cooper knocked loudly at the door. When the servants came in haste and saw only the cooper standing at the gate, they were very indignant and scolded him soundly for coming at such an hour and waking them all out of their sleep. The king, hearing the noise and the cause of it, sent for the cooper, for he felt certain the man must have some important business to have come and disturbed the whole palace at such an early hour. The cooper asked permission to unload his mule, and Cannetella crept out of the barrel. At first the king refused to believe that it was really his daughter, for she had changed so terribly in a few years, and had grown so thin and pale, that it was pitiful to see her. At last the princess showed her father a mole she had on her right arm, and then he saw that the poor girl was indeed his long-lost Cannetella. He kissed her 1,000 times, and instantly had the choicest food and drink set before her. After she had satisfied her hunger, the king said to her, Who would have thought, my dear daughter, to have found you in such a state? What, may I ask, has brought you to this pass?" Cannetella replied, "That wicked man with the gold head and teeth treated me worse than a dog, and many a time since I left you have I longed to die. But I couldn't tell you all that I have suffered, for you would never believe me. It is enough that I am once more with you, and I shall never leave you again, for I would rather be a slave in your house than queen in any other." In the meantime, Sciorravante had returned to the stables, and one of the horses told him that Cannetella had been taken away by a cooper in a barrel. When the wicked magician heard this, he was beside himself with rage, and hastening to the kingdom of Bello Puojo, he went straight to an old woman who lived exactly opposite the royal palace, and said to her, "If you will let me see the king's daughter, I will give you whatever reward you like to ask for." The woman demanded 100 ducats of gold, and Sciorravante counted them out of his purse and gave them to her without a murmur. Then the old woman led him to the roof of the house, where he could see Cannetella combing out her long hair in a room in the top story of the palace. The princess happened to look out of the window, and when she saw her husband gazing at her, she got such a fright that she flew downstairs to the king and said, "My lord and father, unless you shut me up instantly in a room with 7 iron doors, I am lost." "If that's all," said the king, "it shall be done at once." And he gave orders for the doors to be closed on the spot. When Sciorravante saw this, he returned to the old woman and said, "I will give you whatever you like if you will go into the palace, hide under the princess's bed, and slip this little piece of paper beneath her pillow, saying as you do so, 'May every one in the palace except the princess fall into a sound sleep.'" The old woman demanded another 100 golden ducats, and then proceeded to carry out the magician's wishes. No sooner had she slipped the piece of paper under Cannetella's pillow than all the people in the palace fell fast asleep, and only the princess remained awake. Then Sciorravante hurried to the 7 doors and opened them one after the other. Cannetella screamed with terror when she saw her husband, but no one came to her help, for all in the palace lay as if they were dead. The magician seized her in the bed on which she lay and was going to carry her off with him, when the little piece of paper which the old woman had placed under her pillow fell on the floor. In an instant all the people in the palace woke up, and as Cannetella was still screaming for help, they rushed to her rescue. They seized Sciorravante and put him to death, so he was caught in the trap which he had laid for the princess, and, as is so often the case in this world, the biter himself was bit. The End. Long, Broad, and Quick-Eye, from the Gray Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Once upon a time there lived a king who had an only son whom he loved dearly. Now one day the king sent for his son and said to him, "My dearest child, my hair is gray and I am old, and soon I shall feel no more warmth of the sun or look upon the trees and flowers. But before I die I should like to see you with a good wife. Therefore marry my son as speedily as possible." "My father," replied the prince, "now and always I ask nothing better than to do your bidding, but I know of no daughter-in-law that I could give you." On hearing these words, the old king drew from his pocket a key of gold and gave it to his son, saying, "Go up the staircase right up to the top of the tower, look carefully round you, and then come and tell me which you like best of all that you see." So the young man went up. He had never before been in the tower, and had no idea what it might contain. The staircase wound round and round and round, till the prince was almost giddy, and every now and then he caught sight of a large room that opened out from the side. But he had been told to go to the top, and to the top he went. Then he found himself in a hall which had an iron door at one end. This door he unlocked with his golden key, and he passed through into a vast chamber which had a roof of blue sprinkled with golden stars and a carpet of green silk soft as turf. 12 windows framed in gold let in the light of the sun, and on every window was painted the figure of a young girl, each more beautiful than the last. While the prince gazed at them in surprise, not knowing which he liked best, the girls began to lift their eyes and smile at him. He waited, expecting them to speak, but no sound came. Suddenly he noticed that one of the windows was covered by a curtain of white silk. He lifted it and saw before him the image of a maiden, beautiful as the day and sad as the tomb, clothed in a white robe, having a girdle of silver and a crown of pearls. The prince stood and gazed at her, as if he had been turned into stone, but as he looked the sadness which was on her face seemed to pass into his heart, and he cried out, "This one shall be my wife, this one and no other." As he said the words, the young girl blushed and hung her head, and all the other figures vanished. The young prince went quickly back to his father and told him all he had seen and which wife he had chosen. The old man listened to him full of sorrow, and then he spoke. "You have done ill, my son, to search out that which was hidden, and you are running to meet a great danger. This young girl has fallen into the power of a wicked sorcerer who lives in an iron castle. Many young men have tried to deliver her, and none have ever come back. But what is done is done. You have given your word, and it cannot be broken. Go, dare your fate, and return to me safe and sound." So the prince embraced his father, mounted his horse, and set forth to seek his bride. He rode on gaily for several hours, till he found himself in a wood where he had never been before, and soon lost his way among its winding paths and deep valleys. He tried in vain to see where he was. The thick trees shut out the sun, and he could not tell which was north and which was south, so that he might know what direction to make for. He felt in despair, and had quite given up all hope of getting out of this horrible place, when he heard a voice calling to him. "Hey, hey, stop a minute." The prince turned round and saw behind him a very tall man running as fast as his legs would carry him. "Wait for me," he panted, "and take me into your service. If you do, you will never be sorry." "Who are you?" asked the prince, "and what can you do?" "Long is my name, and I can lengthen my body at will. Do you see that nest up there on the top of that pine tree? Well, I can get it for you without taking the trouble of climbing the tree." And Long stretched himself up and up and up, till he was very soon as tall as the pine itself. He put the nest in his pocket, and before you could wink your eyelid he had made himself small again, and stood before the prince. "Yes, you know your business," said he, "but birds' nests are no use to me. I am too old for them. Now, if you were only able to get me out of this wood, you would indeed be good for something." "Oh, there's no difficulty about that," replied Long, and he stretched himself up and up and up till he was 3 times as tall as the tallest tree in the forest. Then he looked all round and said, "We must go in this direction in order to get out of the wood," and shortening himself again, he took the prince's horse by the bridle and led him along. Very soon they got clear of the forest, and saw before them a wide plain ending in a pile of high rocks, covered here and there with trees, and very much like the fortifications of a town. As they left the wood behind, Long turned to the prince and said, "My lord, here comes my comrade. You should take him into your service too, as you will find him a great help." "Well, call him then, so that I can see what sort of a man he is." "He is a little too far off for that," replied Long. "He would hardly hear my voice, and he couldn't be here for some time yet, as he has so much to carry. I think I had better go and bring him myself." And this time he stretched himself to such a height that his head was lost in the clouds. He made 2 or 3 strides, took his friend on his back, and set him down before the prince. The newcomer was a very fat man, and as round as a barrel. "Who are you?" asked the prince, "and what can you do?" "Your worship, Broad is my name, and I can make myself as wide as I please." "Let me see how you manage it." "Run, my lord, as fast as you can, and hide yourself in the wood," cried Broad, and he began to swell himself out. The prince did not understand why he should run to the wood, but when he saw Long flying towards it, he thought he had better follow his example. He was only just in time, for Broad had so suddenly inflated himself that he very nearly knocked over the prince and his horse too. He covered all the space for acres round. You would have thought he was a mountain. At length Broad ceased to expand, drew a deep breath that made the whole forest tremble, and shrank into his usual size. "You have made me run away," said the prince, "but it is not every day one meets with a man of your sort. I will take you into my service." So the three companions continued their journey, and when they were drawing near the rocks, they met a man whose eyes were covered by a bandage. "Your Excellency," said Long, "this is our third comrade. You will do well to take him into your service, and I assure you, you will find him worth his salt." "Who are you?" asked the prince, "and why are your eyes bandaged? You can never see your way." "It is just the contrary, my lord. It is because I see only too well that I am forced to bandage my eyes. Even so I see as well as people who have no bandage. When I take it off, my eyes pierce through everything. Everything I look at catches fire, or if it cannot catch fire, it falls into 1,000 pieces. They call me Quick-Eye." And so saying, he took off his bandage and turned towards the rock. As he fixed his eyes upon it, a crack was heard, and in a few moments it was nothing but a heap of sand. In the sand something might be detected glittering brightly. Quick-Eye picked it up and brought it to the prince. It turned out to be a lump of pure gold. "You are a wonderful creature," said the prince, "and I should be a fool not to take you into my service. But since your eyes are so good, tell me if I am very far from the Iron Castle, and what is happening there just now." "If you were traveling alone," replied Quick-Eye, "it would take you at least a year to get to it. But as we are with you, we shall arrive there tonight. Just now they are preparing supper." "There is a princess in the castle. Do you see her?" "A wizard keeps her in a high tower guarded by iron bars." "Ah, help me to deliver her," cried the prince, and they promised they would. Then they all set out through the gray rocks, by the breach made by the eyes of Quick-Eye, and passed over great mountains and through deep woods, and every time they met with any obstacle, the three friends contrived somehow to put it aside. As the sun was setting, the prince beheld the towers of the iron castle, and before it sank beneath the horizon, he was crossing the iron bridge which led to the gates. He was only just in time, for no sooner had the sun disappeared altogether than the bridge drew itself up and the gates shut themselves. There was no turning back now. The prince put up his horse in the stable, where everything looked as if a guest was expected, and then the whole party marched straight up to the castle. In the court, in the stables, and all over the great halls, they saw a number of men richly dressed, but every one turned into stone. They crossed an endless set of rooms, all opening into each other, till they reached the dining hall. It was brilliantly lighted, the table was covered with wine and fruit, and was laid for 4. They waited a few minutes expecting someone to come, but as nobody did, they sat down and began to eat and drink, for they were very hungry. When they had done their supper, they looked about for some place to sleep. But suddenly the door burst open, and the wizard entered the hall. He was old and humpbacked, with a bald head and a gray beard that fell to his knees. He wore a black robe, and instead of a belt, 3 iron circlets clasped his waist. He led by the hand a lady of wonderful beauty, dressed in white, with a girdle of silver and a crown of pearls, but her face was pale and sad as death itself. The prince knew her in an instant, and moved eagerly forward, but the wizard gave him no time to speak, and said, "I know why you are here. Very good. You may have her if for 3 nights following you can prevent her making her escape. If you fail in this, you and your servants will all be turned into stone, like those who have come before you." And offering the princess a chair, he left the hall. The prince could not take his eyes from the princess. She was so lovely. He began to talk to her, but she neither answered nor smiled, and sat as if she were made of marble. He seated himself by her and determined not to close his eyes that night for fear she should escape him. And in order that she should be doubly guarded, Long stretched himself like a strap all round the room. Broad took his stand by the door and puffed himself out so that not even a mouse could slip by, and Quickeye leant against a pillar which stood in the middle of the floor and supported the roof. But in half a second they were all sound asleep, and they slept sound the whole night long. In the morning, at the first peep of dawn, the Prince awoke with a start, but the Princess was gone. He aroused his servants and implored them to tell him what he must do. "Calm yourself, my lord," said Quickeye. "I have found her already. 100 miles from here there is a forest. In the middle of the forest an old oak, and on top of the oak an acorn. This acorn is the Princess. If Long will take me on his shoulders, we shall bring her back." And sure enough, in less time than it takes to walk round a cottage, they had returned from the forest, and Long presented the acorn to the Prince. "Now, your Excellency, throw it on the ground." The Prince obeyed, and was enchanted to see the Princess appear at his side. But when the sun peeped for the first time over the mountains, the door burst open as before, and the Wizard entered with a loud laugh. Suddenly he caught sight of the Princess. His face darkened. He uttered a low growl, and one of the iron circlets gave way with a crash. He seized the young girl by the hand and bore her away with him. All that day the Prince wandered about the castle, studying the curious treasures it contained, but everything looked as if life had suddenly come to a standstill. In one place he saw a prince who had been turned into stone in the act of brandishing a sword round which his 2 hands were clasped. In another, the same doom had fallen upon a knight in the act of running away. In a third, a serving man was standing eternally trying to convey a piece of beef to his mouth, and all around them were others, still preserving for evermore the attitudes they were in when the Wizard had commanded, "From henceforth to be turned into marble." In the castle and round the castle all was dismal and desolate. Trees there were but without leaves. Fields there were but no grass grew on them. There was one river, but it never flowed, and no fish lived in it. No flowers blossomed, and no birds sang. 3 times during the day food appeared, as if by magic, for the Prince and his servants, and it was not until supper was ended that the Wizard appeared, as on the previous evening, and delivered the Princess into the care of the Prince. All 4 determined that this time they would keep awake at any cost, but it was no use. Off they went as they had done before, and when the Prince awoke the next morning the room was again empty. With a pang of shame he rushed to find Quickeye. "Awake! Awake, Quickeye! Do you know what has become of the Princess?" Quickeye rubbed his eyes and answered, "Yes, I see her. 200 miles from here there is a mountain. In this mountain is a rock. In the rock a precious stone. This stone is the Princess. Long shall take me there, and we will be back before you can turn round." So Long took him on his shoulders, and they set out. At every stride they covered 20 miles, and as they drew near, Quickeye fixed his burning eyes on the mountain. In an instant it split into 1,000 pieces, and in one of these sparkled the precious stone. They picked it up and brought it to the Prince, who flung it hastily down, and as the stone touched the floor, the Princess stood before him. When the Wizard came, his eyes shot forth flames of fury. Crick-crack was heard, and another of his iron bands broke and fell. He seized the Princess by the hand and led her off, growling louder than ever. All that day things went on exactly as they had done the day before. After supper the Wizard brought back the Princess, and looking him straight in the eyes he said, "We shall see which of us 2 will gain the prize after all." That night they struggled their very hardest to keep awake, and even walked about instead of sitting down. But it was quite useless. One after another they had to give in, and for the 3rd time the Princess slipped through their fingers. When morning came, it was as usual the Prince who awoke the first, and as usual the Princess being gone, he rushed to Quickeye. Get up, Quickeye, and tell me where is the Princess?" Quickeye looked about for some time without answering. "Oh, my lord, she is far, very far. 300 miles away there lies a black sea. In the middle of this sea there is a little shell, and in the middle of the shell is fixed a gold ring. That gold ring is the princess. But do not vex your soul, we will get her. Only today Long must take Broad with him. He will be wanted badly." So Long took Quickeye on one shoulder and Broad on the other, and they set out. At each stride they left 30 miles behind them. When they reached the Black Sea, Quickeye showed them the spot where they must seek the shell. But though Long stretched down his hand as far as it would go, he could not find the shell, for it lay at the bottom of the sea. "Wait a moment, comrades. It will be all right. I will help you," said Broad. Then he swelled himself out so that you would have thought the world could hardly have held him, and stooping down he drank. He drank so much at every mouthful that only a minute or so passed before the water had sunk enough for Long to put his hand to the bottom. He soon found the shell and pulled the ring out, but time had been lost, and Long had a double burden to carry. The dawn was breaking fast before they got back to the castle, where the prince was waiting for them in an agony of fear. Soon the first rays of the sun were seen peeping over the tops of the mountains. The door burst open, and finding the prince standing alone, the wizard broke into peals of wicked laughter. But as he laughed, a loud crash was heard. The window fell into 1,000 pieces. A gold ring glittered in the air, and the princess stood before the enchanter. For Quickeye, who was watching from afar, had told Long of the terrible danger now threatening the prince, and Long, summoning all his strength for one gigantic effort, had thrown the ring right through the window. The wizard shrieked and howled with rage till the whole castle trembled to its foundations. Then a crash was heard. The third band split in two, and a crow flew out of the window. Then the princess at length broke the enchanted silence, and blushing like a rose, gave the prince her thanks for her unlooked-for deliverance. But it was not only the princess who was restored to life by the flight of the wicked black crow. The marble figures became men once more, and took up their occupations just as they had left them off. The horses neighed in the stables, the flowers blossomed in the garden, the birds flew in the air, the fish darted in the water. Everywhere you looked, all was life, all was joy. And the knights who had been turned into stone came in a body to offer their homage to the prince who had set them free. "Do not thank me," he said, "for I have done nothing. Without my faithful servants, Long, Broad, and Quickeye, I should even have been as one of you." With these words he bade them farewell, and departed with the princess and his faithful companions for the kingdom of his father. The old king, who had long since given up all hope, wept for joy at the sight of his son, and insisted that the wedding should take place as soon as possible. All the knights who had been enchanted in the Iron Castle were invited to the ceremony, and after it had taken place, Long, Broad, and Quickeye took leave of the young couple, saying that they were going to look for more work. The prince offered them all their hearts could desire if they would only remain with him, but they replied that an idle life would not please them, and that they could never be happy unless they were busy. So they went away to seek their fortunes, and for all I know are seeking still. The End.
The Ogre, from the Grey Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. There lived, once upon a time, in the land of Mersliano, a poor woman called Marcella, who had 6 pretty daughters, all as upright as young fir trees, and an only son called Antonio, who was so simple as to be almost an idiot. Hardly a day passed without his mother saying to him, "What are you doing, you useless creature? If you were too stupid to look after yourself, I would order you to leave the house and never to let me see your face again." Every day the youth committed some fresh piece of folly, till at last Marcella, losing all patience, gave him a good beating, which so startled Antonio that he took to his heels and never stopped running till it was dark and the stars were shining in the heavens. He wandered on for some time, not knowing where to go, and at last he came to a cave, at the mouth of which sat an ogre, uglier than anything you can conceive. He had a huge head and wrinkled brow, eyebrows that met, a squinting eyes, and a flat broad nose, and a great gash of a mouth from which 2 tusks stuck out. His skin was hairy, his arms enormous, his legs like sword blades, and his feet as flat as ducks. In short, he was the most hideous and laughable object in the world. But Antonio, who, with all his faults, was no coward, and was moreover a very civil-spoken lad, took off his hat and said, "Good day, sir. I hope you are pretty well. Could you kindly tell me how far it is from here to the place where I wish to go?" When the ogre heard this extraordinary question, he burst out laughing. As he liked the youth's polite manner, he said to him, "Will you enter my service?" "What wages do you give?" replied Antonio. "If you serve me faithfully," returned the ogre, "I'll be bound you'll get enough wages to satisfy you." So the bargain was struck, and Antonio agreed to become the ogre's servant. He was very well treated in every way, and he had little or no work to do, with the result that in a few days he became as fat as a quail, as round as a barrel, as red as a lobster, and as impudent as a bantam cock. But after 2 years the lad got weary of this idle life, and longed desperately to visit his home again. The ogre, who could see into his heart and knew how unhappy he was, said to him one day, "My dear Antonio, I know how much you long to see your mother and sisters again, and because I love you as the apple of my eye, I am willing to allow you to go home for a visit. Therefore, take this donkey, so that you may not have to go on foot. But see that you never say Bricklebrit to him, for if you do, you'll be sure to regret it." Antonio took the beast without as much as saying thank you, and jumping on its back, he rode away in great haste. But he hadn't gone 200 yards when he dismounted and called out, "Bricklebrit." No sooner had he pronounced the word than the donkey opened its mouth and poured forth rubies, emeralds, diamonds, and pearls as big as walnuts. Antonio gazed in amazement at the sight of such wealth, and joyfully filling a huge sack with the precious stones, he mounted the donkey again and rode on him till he came to an inn. Here he got down, and going straight to the landlord, he said to him, "My good man, I must ask you to stable this donkey for me. Be sure you give the poor beast plenty of oats and hay, but beware of saying the word Bricklebrit to him, for if you do, I can promise you will regret it. Take this heavy sack too, and put it carefully away from me." The landlord, who was no fool, on receiving the strange warning and seeing the precious stones sparkling through the canvas of the sack, was most anxious to see what would happen if he used the forbidden word. So he gave Antonio an excellent dinner, with a fine bottle of old wine, and prepared a comfortable bed for him. As soon as he saw the poor simpleton's close his eyes and heard his lusty snores, he hurried to the stables and said to the donkey, "Bricklebrit," and the animal, as usual, poured out any number of precious stones. When the landlord saw all these treasures, he longed to get possession of so valuable an animal, and determined to steal the donkey from his foolish guest. As soon as it was light next morning, Antonio awoke, and having rubbed his eyes and stretched himself about 100 times, he called to the landlord and said, "Come here, my friend, and produce your bill, for short reckonings make long friends." When Antonio had paid his account, he went to the stables and took out his donkey, as he thought, and fastening a sack of gravel, which the landlord had substituted for his precious stones, on the creature's back, and he set out for his home. No sooner had he arrived there than he called out, "Mother, come quickly, and bring tablecloths and sheets with you, and spread them out on the ground, and you will soon see what wonderful treasures I have brought you." His mother hurried into the house, and opening the linen chest where she kept her daughter's wedding outfits, she took out tablecloths and sheets made from the finest linen, and spread them flat and smooth on the ground. Antonio placed the donkey on them, and called out, "Bricklebrit." But this time he met with no success, for the donkey took no more notice of the magic word than he would have done if a lyre had been twanged in his ear. 2, 3, and 4 times did Antonio pronounce Bricklebrit, but all in vain, and he might as well have spoken to the wind. Disgusted and furious with the poor creature, he seized a thick stick and began to beat it so hard that he nearly broke every bone in its body. The miserable donkey was so distracted at such treatment that, far from pouring out precious stones, it only tore and dirtied all the fine linen. When poor Marcella saw her tablecloths and sheets being destroyed, and that, instead of becoming rich, she had only been made a fool of, she seized another stick and belaboured Antonio so unmercifully with it that he fled before her and never stopped till he reached the ogre's cave. When his master saw the lad returning in such a sorry plight, he understood at once what had happened to him. Making no bones about the matter, he told Antonio what a fool he had been to allow himself to be imposed upon by the landlord, and to let a worthless animal be palmed off of him instead of his magic donkey. Antonio listened humbly to the ogre's words and vowed solemnly that he would never act so foolishly again. And so a year passed, and once more Antonio was overcome by a fit of homesickness, and felt a great longing to see his own people again. Now the ogre, although he was so hideous to look upon, had a very kind heart, and when he saw how restless and unhappy Antonio was, he at once gave him leave to go home on a visit. At parting he gave him a beautiful tablecloth, and said, "Give this to your mother. But see you don't lose it as you lost the donkey. Until you are safely in your own house, beware of saying, 'Tablecloth open,' and 'Tablecloth shut.' If you do, the misfortune be on your own head, for I have given you fair warning." Antonio set out on his journey, but hardly had he got out of sight of the cave than he laid the tablecloth on the ground and said, "Tablecloth open." In an instant the tablecloth unfolded itself and disclosed a whole mass of precious stones and other treasures. When Antonio perceived this, he said, "Tablecloth shut," and continued his journey. He came to the same inn again, and calling the landlord to him, he told him to put the tablecloth carefully away, and whatever he did, not to say "Tablecloth open" or "Tablecloth shut" to it. The landlord, who was a regular rogue, answered, "Just leave it to me, I'll look after it as if it were my own." After he had given Antonio plenty to eat and drink, and had provided him with a comfortable bed, he went straight to the tablecloth and said, "Tablecloth open." It opened at once and displayed such costly treasures that the landlord made up his mind on the spot to steal it. When Antonio awoke the next morning, his host handed him over a tablecloth exactly like his own, and carrying it carefully over his arm, the foolish youth went straight to his mother's house, and said, "Now we shall be rich beyond the dreams of avarice, and need never to go about in rags again, or lack the best of food." With these words he spread the tablecloth on the ground and said, "Tablecloth open." But he might repeat the injunction as often as he pleased. It was only a waste of breath, for nothing happened. When Antonio saw this, he turned to his mother and said, "That old scoundrel of a landlord has done me once more, but he will live to repent it, for if I ever enter his inn again, I will make him suffer for the loss of my donkey and the other treasures he has robbed me of." Marcella was in such a rage over her fresh disappointment that she could not restrain her impatience, and, turning on Antonio, she abused him soundly and told him to get out of her sight at once, for she would never acknowledge him as a son of hers again. The poor boy was very depressed by her words, and slunk back to his master like a dog with his tail between his legs. When the ogre saw him, he guessed at once what had happened, and gave Antonio a good scolding, and said, "I don't know what prevents me from smashing your head in, you useless ne'er-do-well. You blurt everything out, and your long tongue never ceases wagging for a moment. If you had remained silent in the inn, this misfortune would have never overtaken you, so you have only yourself to blame for your present suffering." Antonio listened to his master's words in silence, looking for all the world like a whipped dog. When he had been 3 more years in the ogre's service, he had another bad fit of homesickness, and longed very much to see his mothers and sisters again. So he asked permission to go home on a visit, and it was at once granted to him. Before he set out on his journey, the ogre presented him with a beautifully carved stick and said, "Take this stick as a remembrance of me. But beware of saying, 'Rise up, stick,' and 'Lie down, stick.' For if you do, I can only say I wouldn't be in your shoes for something." Antonio took the stick and said, "Don't be in the least alarmed. I'm not such a fool as you think, and know better than most people what 2 and 2 make." "I'm glad to hear it," replied the ogre. "But words are women, deeds are men. You have heard what I said, and forewarned is forearmed." This time Antonio thanked his master warmly for all his kindness, and started on his homeward journey in great spirits. But he had not gone half a mile when he said, "Rise up, stick." The words were hardly out of his mouth when the stick rose and began to rain down blows upon poor Antonio's back with such lightning-like rapidity that he had hardly the strength to call out, "Lie down, stick!" But as soon as he uttered the words, the stick lay down and ceased beating his back black and blue. Although he had learnt a lesson at some cost to himself, Antonio was full of joy, for now he saw a way of revenging himself on the wicked landlord. Once more he arrived at the inn, and was received in the most friendly and hospitable manner by his host. Antonio greeted him cordially and said, "My friend, will you kindly take care of this stick for me? But whatever you do, don't say 'Rise up, stick.' If you do, you will be sorry for it, and you needn't expect any sympathy from me." The landlord, thinking he was coming in for a 3rd piece of good fortune, gave Antonio an excellent supper, and after he had seen him comfortably to bed, he ran to the stick, calling to his wife to come and see the fun. He lost no time in pronouncing the words, "Rise up, stick." The moment he spoke, the stick jumped up and beat the landlord so unmercifully that he and his wife ran screaming to Antonio, and waking him up, pleaded for mercy. When Antonio saw how successful his trick had been, he said, "I refuse to help you unless you give me all that you have stolen from me, otherwise you will be beaten to death." The landlord, who felt himself at death's door already, cried out, "Take back your property, only release me from this terrible stick." And with these words he ordered the donkey, the tablecloth, and other treasures to be restored to their rightful owner. As soon as Antonio had recovered his belongings, he said, "Stick, lie down," and it stopped beating the landlord at once. Then he took his donkey and tablecloth and arrived safely at his home with them. This time the magic words had the desired effect, and the donkey and tablecloth provided the family with treasures untold. Antonio soon married off his sister, made his mother rich for life, and they all lived happily for ever after.